Hello, welcome to IWCTV Now, with me, Jack Print. On today's referendum special, we will be discussing the issues regarding the voting age in the UK, discussing whether the voting age should be lowered to 16. Later on the show, we will be also looking at the EU referendum and hearing the view from our main political parties on the island. But first, here's a short report on the subject of the voting age.
A topic of recent debate has been whether or not to lower the legal voting age to include 16 and 17-year-olds. There is an argument that 16-year-olds are going to be most affected by the vote, so they should have a say in the matter. During the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, 16-year-olds were given the opportunity to vote. 75% of 16 and 17-year-olds voted, which was a significantly higher turnout than any other age group. According to the British election study, the number of young people voting in the general elections has been steadily growing. 38% turned out for the 2005 general election, increasing to 52% in 2010, though these figures did lower in 2015 when only 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. Less than 50 years ago, the legal voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, at the time a controversial decision which is now considered a normality. Now that the notion of under 18 voting is being seriously discussed in Britain, the ever-present question is, could this become the new normal? And if so, are 16 and 17-year-olds educated enough to make an informed decision when it comes to voting?
I think that if it's from a lower age that they're being educated, then teenagers will be more likely to have a wider view on what political parties they'd want to vote for.
Well, I think if they knew that that was going to happen at 16, then they would be more likely to get, even if they didn't take the option at 16, by the time they're 18, they're starting to think about it, aren't they?
I am now joined in the studio by Andrew Turner, who is the current Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight, Stewart Blackmore from the Labour Party, Vic Lowthion from the Green Party. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
So first question, what are your opinions and feelings on the voting age? Do you think it should be lowered so people under 18 can vote, as in the case of the Scottish referendum last year, or should it stay as it is? We'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, I don't think it should be changed, but more important, it shouldn't be changed for a particular event such as this referendum. It would be a good thing if we looked at it apart from specific elections. It's not so good to put it as one which would encourage people, for instance, for the referendum.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Vix?
I think it's like with the Scottish referendum, that is actually an impetus for us to start changing the law. I mean, there are many other countries where 16-year-olds can vote, Norway, Brazil, Austria, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey. You know, this is actually something which is a growing movement, and Britain is the foundation of world democracy, and we should be leading the way in that.
Well, as with other things, I disagree fundamentally with Andrew in this issue, because I believe that, especially in the European referendum, that it's people like the students of this college who are 16-year-olds and above who this decision is going to affect pretty quickly. And therefore they should have a right to have a say in what's going to affect them down the line. If you're 16 or 18, by the time the negotiations are over in probably 2 years' time, you're going to be 18 years old, and things are going to have a fundamental effect on jobs, on the economy and employment as far as 16 to 18 years. So I think, differing from Andrew in this, especially over the, generally accepted it should be 16 and above, but especially I would like to see, I don't think it will happen because I don't think the government will introduce it in time, but I think really that 16-year-olds have a vested interest in this European election, and therefore they should have a vote.
So do you think lowering the voting age would encourage more people affected? Would they be more likely to vote? Sure,
like Vic's just said, I think the lowering of the age in Scotland at the last election was fundamental to the result of the election. Not quite so much as the SNP had said, because not quite so many voted SNP in the analysis after the election of voting patterns as they said would do before. But I know I'm Scottish, as you probably noticed by my accent, and most of my family still live in Scotland. And I was absolutely surprised in my visits to Scotland how many people had changed their mind on this issue, and how many people after the voting age had been reduced in Scotland were in complete agreement with it. People who disagree with it now think it's a good thing.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I can understand people seeing this had such an effect in Scotland, but the problem was the same in Scotland, that they suddenly got the view, oh, we have this referendum in this case to become independent. How can we make it more likely, although it didn't turn out to be like this, that the people who they most could get to vote for in favour of leaving could vote? What is really wanted is for the question to be put in front of people without these different types of referendums and so on. In their case, look at the referendum. Look at the referendum or the election as a good thing which should be done, or not a good thing, therefore we shouldn't do it. It's got to be something which is done separately from which election it is.
That's a rather cynical approach, though, isn't it? I mean,
well,
it's
true.
To think that we would only want people to vote at the age of 16 because we wanted them to vote a particular way.
That's
As
true.
you said, in Scotland, they didn't necessarily vote that particular way. I think that if you ask 16 to 18-year-olds about Europe, they may not vote how you particularly thought, but the important thing is that they do get a voice to vote on that. I mean, we've managed to dumb down or to even ignore the citizenship curriculum, which was introduced about 15 years ago, which is introduced to encourage people to actively participate. We're starting to do that in the Education White Paper that was revealed this week about getting more sort of national citizenship award and encouraging young people to get more involved. What's the point in doing that when you then say, oh, well, you've got to wait another 2 years until you can actually actively participate? You need to have that progression, because 18 to 24-year-olds, as you can see, are the least likely to vote because they've left home. You know, registration of voting, that's a real concern at the moment.
It's also interesting to listen to Andrew's argument when, in fact, Ruth Davidson, who's a leader of the Conservatives in Scotland and some tout as a future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, if it's still united by then, of course, now says she's a fully paid up member of the Voting at 16 club, whereas before she was very cynical about it. Before the referendum in Scotland, she was extremely cynical about it, but now she's a fully paid up member of the club. So there's hope for you, Andrew. You might come along.
I know. Oh yes, I'm prepared to accept that.
So with more than 50%, hold on. There are quite a few people under the age of 18 in our country that know a lot about politics and wish that they could vote. Do you think this makes the system unfair in that sense?
I think there's something like 1.5 million people who are disenfranchised at the moment, and a lot of these people I know from my membership of the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party when I was 15 years old. It was called the Young Socialists then, of course. But even now, and on the Isle of Wight, we are gaining in membership. So there's a hunger there with young people who want to be engaged with politics, and this is part of the engagement. I think that they're having a vote. They're entitled to join the armed forces, they're entitled to get married, they're entitled to do all sorts of things which deem them to be adults, but they're not allowed to vote. I think there's a great cut-off there somewhere.
But I don't think it should just be aimed at people who are already interested in politics. The whole point is that we want to get more people interested in politics, isn't it? So it's not just about those people that want to but can't, but it's about having that conversation with 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and it's just been a natural way of discussing things and not just limiting it to you know, less important discussions, shall we say.
So how would the... wait, hold on. Questions have been mixed up. Why do you think it's taken this long for younger people to have been considered to vote? Why was it not done years ago?
You could ask that question about the right of women to vote 100
emancipation,
years ago, couldn't you?
the
These things happen when, like I said, there is perceived to be a need for it, and this is why I do think it's important that we had considered this, you know, 6 months, a year ago about the EU referendum, because we knew it was going to happen. You know, we didn't need to have that in a very brief discussion. It did need to be tabled properly and thoroughly discussed, but we should have done this a lot earlier than that.
You're right about that. It is almost too late to introduce this for this forthcoming referendum.
I don't see it being too late, Andrew, but I think there's a catalyst, as Vix has just said. It happened with the suffragette movement and the emancipation of votes for women at the beginning of the last century. There was a great movement came out of the ground, and the government of the day had to accept that this was something that could not be stopped. It was a natural phenomenon that was going to happen one way or another. This is going to be the same thing. It's going to be. I agree with Andrew. I don't agree with the time frame. I think the government wanted it to happen. It could happen, but I don't think the cynic inside me says it won't happen because the government doesn't want it to happen in time for the European referendum. But I think it'll come, and certainly if there was a Labour government, it would come.
Okay, so do you think if the voting age was lowered, it would make more people that age, you know, want to vote?
Well, actually, I was rather struck by the figures shown in Scotland, which were 75% of people 16 to 18 did vote. Actually, I seem to remember the national percentage who had voted was more like 85%. In other words, there were fewer people 16 to 18 than 18 plus.
So, ending this, what would, with a simple yes or no, do you think lowering the voting age would benefit Britain?
Absolutely yes.
Yes.
Not really.
Okay. So, some interesting views there. So now for our next story, we'll be exploiting the topic of the EU referendum. The vote, which will take place on the 23rd of June this year, will allow the British public to decide whether or not the UK should leave the European Union. As before, our guests will be giving their views on the hot topic. Before that, we have Connor Keeble with a report.
During the 2015 general election campaign, Prime Minister David Cameron announced he was going to implement a referendum regarding on whether or not Britain should stay in the European Union. This referendum has been regarded by some as one of the most important decisions made in recent memory, as both staying in the EU and leaving the EU could have different effects on the United Kingdom. According to the latest opinion polls, the British public seems split on the decision on whether or not to stay in the EU or to leave it, with the percentage being almost 50-50, making the outcome of the vote a tough one to call. But with so many differing opinions on the subject circulating, how can the British public be sure on what exactly they are voting for? Is there a lack of cohesive information available, or does there more need to be done to inform voters? Supporters of Britain's exit campaign argue that the UK will have better border control, limiting immigration to Britain. The UK will also have greater control over which laws are passed, as they won't have to go through EU regulations. These people also say that Britain is paying too much into the EU with little return, with the UK government paying a total of £13 billion in 2015. However, people who are backing the In campaign say that the UK gains a massive economic boost from being a member of the European Union. Trade with EU countries is much easier, and relationships between these countries is better. Immigrants who arrive in Britain are young and willing to work, which benefits economic growth. The EU referendum will continue to dominate news headlines and divide opinions until the 23rd of June. Connor Keeble, IWCTV Now, Newport.
Again, I'm joined by Stewart Blackmore, Vix Lowthion and Andrew Tanner to discuss their views on the matter. What are your opinions on the Britain leaving the European Union? Is it a good or bad idea? Vix, you can start us off.
I think it would be a bad idea. I think that we're not prepared fully for the upheaval and the difficulty with jobs, with the environment, with all those serious issues that would happen after the 23rd of June. I think that the EU exactly needs reform, but you can't reform it from the outside. If we leave, that's it. We cannot reform it. We have to try and make our own way, which is incredibly damaging and incredibly unstable, which is what we need, is stability in our economy and for our government.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. I entirely agree with what Vix has just said. I'm very avidly pro-European, but perhaps coming from a slightly perspective, being a member of the Labour Party, I think there are very, very hard-fought concessions that are enshrined in the EU law that if we come out of the EU with regard to employment, workers' rights, the Working Time Directive, working mothers, children, welfare benefits, all of these things, if people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have their way, who are, I don't think would be stretched to say that they're on the right of the Conservative Party. I think that these people are waiting with scalpels to take a knife, to use a well-worn metaphor, to all of these laws. And I think that the people who are going to be suffering are the people who can least afford it. People are suffering enough at the moment with the welfare cuts and everything else. But if we were to leave Europe, I think that would be as nothing compared to what would be coming down the line.
I think the first thing to remember is this is not something which is loved by the right and not by the left. Members of Parliament like Kate Hoey are in favour of leaving the common market in exactly the same way. And what we've got to understand is this would give our people in this country the right to make their own decisions. It doesn't matter whether they want more immigration or less immigration. That should be made in this country rather than in Germany, Denmark, all over Europe. It's a very important issue as far as we are concerned, because we have the right to make our own decisions.
But it takes away our ability to trade freely within Europe. You know, with having that, which would be an obvious bonus, being able to directly make our decisions. We can make our decisions.
No, we can't.
It's just that we have to work within across the borders because we're in this common market.
Yes, but the trouble is the common market doesn't give us any control at all in the people from Europe, i.e. the EU, who want to come to this country. They can do so. We cannot stop it. Only the people outside of Europe, such as Indians and Pakistanis, we can prevent them coming, but we can't prevent people from the rest of Europe coming to our country.
But we have
now, the second thing is how we're going to be a great deal better off because we get most people sending the things they buy, and we want to continue to that. And of course the Germans wouldn't be saying, no, you're not to buy a Mercedes.
Yes, but we wouldn't necessarily have those things with tariff-free, would we? I mean, you're correct about there are over 3 million people living in the UK that come from the non-EU countries, you know, ex-Commonwealth, India, Pakistan and so on. There are 2 million people from the EU. It's not like we're overrun by people from the EU in here. We have more people from outside the EU that are here. We have more people, British people, expats that are living in Spain and living in the EU, working in Eastern Europe. You know, it's a two-way street. We have benefits that come to us that we would lose out on if we left in June.
Absolutely, and the thing about immigration is a bit of a red herring, with all due respect, Andrew. Germany has taken 1 million people over the past year. 1 million people, when you think about it. We've taken in the low thousands to the teens and the thousands as far as immigration is concerned. But as far as tariffs and everything else are concerned, if we leave the European Union on the 24th of June, which would be the day that it would have to be announced to Parliament after the referendum, and a successful no referendum on the 23rd, then we have 2 years in which to negotiate. Now, we have 2 years to negotiate with 27 countries against us. What are the benefits of that? How are they going to? They are in the strong position of 27 against 1. And it's all very well saying, well, we're not going to stop buying Mercedes or BMWs or whatever. That may be the case, but how much are we going to have to pay for it? What are the tariffs that are going to be involved in these things?
The answer would be a maximum of 3%, because there is a limit to the amount of tax any country imposes such things by the when we come out, just as there would be if we were importing stuff from Canada.
If you imagine, like you're saying, Stewart, on 24th of June, and you are a business leader in this country, you know, on the island, GKN, BAE, you know, would you want to stay here with that instability hanging over you for the next 2 years? You would seriously consider moving your business.
Well, it's a very important point, especially with regard to people like Siemens, Plessy, GKN. GKN is owned by an Italian company, Augusta Westland. Now, are they going to retain what is a workforce of 12 or 1300 on the Isle of Wight if this were to happen. We have to wait and see. Nobody's telling us. The government's not telling us. Augusta are not telling us. Everybody's waiting to see. And this is what causes the uncertainty about this. People just don't know. I went to a meeting last night, and people in the room, there were about 80 people there, and it was about a third to stay in, a third to go out, and a third who hadn't made their minds up. Now, at the end of the meeting, it was still a third, a third, and a third. People hadn't made their minds up yet, and this is where the confusion arises. We don't have very long to settle our minds on this issue. My mind is settled on it, as you two minds have probably settled it, but there are a lot of people out there who don't know what the hell's going on.
I agree with you.
And I think that's linked into what's the turnout going to be? Who's going to turn out and vote? I think that's what the result is going to be based on, is who turns out and vote. And we know, and you can see from your VT there, that there is a strong out group of people who firmly believe, and if it's raining on the 23rd of June, they will go out and vote. And I do urge people who have reservations and are concerned to make sure that they do vote on that day, because in the same way that we can see in America with Donald Trump and people are going out and voting and he's motivating people, there are people who are motivated by Nigel Farage, by Boris Johnson, by Michael Gove to vote out. And if you don't vote and just let those people vote on your behalf, we can see the turnout, a low turnout, mean that we will vote out of the EU.
Okay, so there's a huge range of views there. So with one last question, which would simply be a yes or no, do you think Britain should stay in the European Union?
Yes.
Yes.
Certainly not.
Okay. So opinion amongst our guests is obviously divided, as it is throughout the country. I guess it's down to us all to consider the arguments that are cast on our vote accordingly on the 23rd of June. But I'd like to thank all our guests for taking the time to come and share their views. So thank you, Andrew, Stewart and Vix.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Next week we will be going to discussing the issues of fracking and how it could affect island life. But for now it's goodbye for my guests and goodbye for me. Goodbye.